You know that feeling when your whole body just locks up and you can't move a single muscle, but your mind is completely awake and screaming? Like, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me on that freezing February night in 2016. And I'm still processing it all, you know? I'm Sky Donovan, I'm 33 now, and what I'm about to tell you is going to sound absolutely insane. But I need you to understand that this really happened. My body was paralyzed, literally paralyzed, the moment aliens took me. But here's where it gets interesting, because you can't really understand what happened that night without knowing who I was before all this crazy stuff started, right? I mean, I've always been different, you know? My parents, they tried their best, but my mom worked as a nurse at Bronson Methodist Hospital, and my dad was in the auto plants. They were practical people who didn't have time for a daughter who claimed she could see energy fields around people. Growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, I was that weird kid who saw things that weren't there, or at least that's what everyone kept telling me. I remember being maybe 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table on Maple Street, and telling my mom about the silver threads I could see connecting people to each other. She'd just sigh and say, "Sky, honey, you have such an imagination." But it wasn't imagination, you know? It was vibrational frequency perception, though I didn't have those words back then. I could see people's auras, their chakra systems, the way their consciousness expanded beyond their physical bodies. I mean, really, how do you explain that to a second grader's teacher when she asks why you're staring at the air above your classmate's head? School was rough. Kids called me Space Case Sky because I was always zoning out, but I wasn't zoning out. I was practicing what I now know was astral projection. During math class, I'd feel my awareness lift up and I'd be floating near the ceiling, looking down at everyone. Sometimes I'd travel to other classrooms, other buildings. One time I ended up at Lake Michigan, just floating over the water, feeling the waves' energy patterns. When I'd snap back into my body, the teacher would be calling my name, and everyone would be staring. By high school, I'd learned to keep quiet about the weird stuff. I went to Kalamazoo Central, tried to fit in, dated normal boys, did normal teenage things. But late at night, when everyone was asleep, I'd practice remote viewing, sending my consciousness to different locations around the city. I discovered I could visit my friends' houses, see what they were doing, sometimes even influence their dreams through telepathic transmission. I know how that sounds, but you know, consciousness isn't limited by physical space. It operates on quantum fields that most people don't even know exist. College at Western Michigan University was where everything started to open up again. I studied anthropology because I was fascinated by how different cultures understood consciousness and reality. You know, here's something most people don't understand about ancient civilizations. They had direct access to galactic consciousness networks that we've completely forgotten about. The Mayans, the Egyptians, even some Native American tribes. They were all working with dimensional shifting techniques and biophotonic energy manipulation. I was doing research on consciousness studies when I first learned about the Akashic records. These are basically etheric databases where all human experiences and knowledge are stored in crystalline matrix formations that exist outside of linear time. Through meditation and neural entrainment practices, you can actually access these records and download information from past lives, future possibilities, even other planetary civilizations. I started having breakthrough sessions where I'd go into deep trance states and come back with detailed knowledge about things I'd never studied. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, you know. Let me tell you about my work after college, because that's really important context for understanding why they chose me. I ended up working at the Kent County Forensics Lab in Grand Rapids. I know, weird career choice for someone with psychic abilities, right? But forensics is actually perfect training for consciousness research because you learn to observe details, document evidence, and piece together stories from fragments of information. Plus, working with crime scenes taught me how to psychically shield myself from negative energies and traumatic imprints that get embedded in physical objects. Dr. Vanessa Blackwell, my supervisor at the lab, she noticed I had unusual insights about cases. I'd pick up evidence and immediately get flashes of information, not just what happened, but the emotional states of everyone involved, the energetic resonance patterns that lingered at crime scenes. She started calling me their intuitive analyst, which was her way of acknowledging my abilities without sounding too new agey, you know? I mean, really, forensic psychometry is a legitimate field, even if mainstream science won't admit it. Objects hold vibrational imprints of the consciousness that interacted with them. If someone was murdered, their terror and pain gets locked into the quantum field around the location. Sensitive people can read those energy signatures like fingerprints. But what I discovered working with evidence is that some cases had signatures that weren't human. There would be these weird electromagnetic distortions around certain objects, energy patterns that didn't match any known biological source. When I mentioned this to Dr. Blackwell, she got really quiet and told me there were things about our work that I wasn't cleared to know about yet. That's when I started doing remote viewing sessions specifically to investigate the unexplained cases. I'd take coordinate targets from crime scenes and project my consciousness there during the investigations. What I found blew my mind. There were non-human entities observing these events, sometimes even influencing them. Tall, thin beings with large eyes and elongated fingers, watching human behavior from dimensional frequencies just outside our normal perception range. I documented everything in encrypted files, but I didn't tell anyone. How do you explain to your colleagues that you've discovered evidence of extraterrestrial involvement in human affairs? I wasn't even sure what it meant at that point. This was all happening in 2015, about a year before the main event I'm telling you about. I was living alone in a small apartment on Division Avenue, spending my evenings practicing consciousness expansion techniques and trying to understand what I was seeing during my remote viewing sessions. What I discovered is that Earth is basically under observation by multiple extraterrestrial civilizations, and humans with psychic abilities are particularly interesting to them because we can serve as bridges between different dimensional frequencies. I'd developed this really structured approach where I'd use binaural beats to achieve theta brainwave states, then project my awareness to specific coordinates and gather intelligence about these non-human presences. They're studying our consciousness evolution, trying to understand how we're developing the capacity for interdimensional communication. But here's where it gets really intense. Some of these groups are more invasive than others. The tall, thin beings I kept encountering during my remote viewing sessions, they had this really clinical, detached energy. They weren't malevolent exactly, but they definitely saw humans as subjects to be studied, rather than equals to be respected. And they were particularly interested in humans who could astral project and remote view because those abilities made us valuable for their research. I started having dreams where I was in metallic rooms being examined by these beings. At first I thought they were just anxiety dreams triggered by my remote viewing discoveries, but the details were too consistent, too vivid. I'd wake up with my left ear aching and sometimes find small drops of blood on my pillowcase. Dr. Michael Torres, my physician at the time, couldn't find any medical explanation for the ear bleeding episodes. Here's something most people don't understand about alien contact. It doesn't usually start with a dramatic abduction. It begins with soft contacts, gradual conditioning, preparation of the human subject for more intensive interactions. My psychic abilities were getting stronger, my remote viewing accuracy was improving, and I was developing what they call phase alignment capacity. The ability to shift consciousness between different dimensional frequencies without losing coherence. They use dream infiltration techniques and astral plane encounters to assess whether someone is ready for physical contact. Looking back, I realized I was being evaluated for months before the actual abduction happened. The night everything changed was February 14th, 2016, Valentine's Day, which is kind of ironic considering it was the least romantic experience of my life. I was driving back from Lansing, where I'd been visiting my college friend Miranda. It was around 11:30 p.m., snowing lightly, and I was taking US 131 south toward Kalamazoo. The radio was playing some soft jazz, and I was thinking about the remote viewing session I'd done that afternoon. I'd been targeting a coordinate in Antarctica, where I suspected there was some kind of underground facility. What I found there was disturbing. Human subjects being held in containment units, undergoing some kind of genetic modification procedures. There were both human and non-human personnel working together, and the whole operation had this really dark, secretive energy. I documented everything as soon as I got back, but I was still processing the implications. So I'm driving along, lost in thought about these visions, when suddenly I noticed this sharp pain in my chest, right around my heart chakra. It felt like someone was sending an electrical current through my entire circulatory system. I reached for the radio to turn it down, thinking maybe the volume was giving me a headache, but my hand wouldn't move. Like, oh my God, that's when I realized my entire body was paralyzed. I could see perfectly, think clearly, even feel sensations, but I couldn't control any voluntary muscle movement. My foot was stuck on the accelerator, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. The car was still moving forward at about 45 miles per hour, and I'm completely helpless to stop it. The terror was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Imagine being trapped inside your own body while hurtling down a dark highway. But here's where it gets really weird. Instead of crashing, the car started slowing down on its own, like someone else was controlling it. It drifted to the right shoulder and came to a gentle stop. The engine shut off, the headlights dimmed, and everything went completely quiet. Even the falling snow seemed to pause in midair. That's when I saw the lights. They started as tiny points of brilliance above the tree line, but they expanded into these geometric patterns that defied physics. I'm talking about biophotonic arrays that created dimensional portals right there above the highway. The light wasn't like anything terrestrial. It had this crystalline quality that seemed to resonate directly with my nervous system. Let me explain this concept because it's crucial to understanding what happened next. These beings use something called cranial transduction arrays to interface with human consciousness. It's a form of neural entrainment that creates quantum locks between their technology and our bioelectric fields. The paralysis wasn't a side effect. It was a necessary component of the connection process. As I sat there, completely immobilized, I watched this craft descend from the portal. It wasn't a typical saucer shape, more like an elongated oval with these flowing, organic curves. The surface looked alive, almost like liquid mercury, but with these patterns of light flowing across it in waves. It landed silently about 50 feet in front of my car. What happened next still gives me chills. 3 beings emerged from the craft, tall, maybe 7 feet, extremely thin, with elongated limbs and fingers. Their skin was translucent white, almost glowing, and their eyes were large and dark, taking up about a third of their face. They moved with this fluid, graceful motion that seemed to defy gravity. I could feel them scanning my consciousness before they even approached the car. It was like having someone rifle through your thoughts and memories without permission. They were accessing my Akashic records, reviewing my psychic development, evaluating my potential for their purposes. The telepathic transmission was overwhelming. Images, concepts, emotions flooding my awareness faster than I could process them. One of them approached my car door, and suddenly I wasn't in the vehicle anymore. I don't remember the transition. One moment I'm paralyzed behind the wheel. The next I'm lying on this metallic table in a small, dimly lit room. The walls had this organic, almost biological appearance, with veins of light pulsing through them like a circulatory system. I was still paralyzed, but I could move my eyes and observe everything around me. There were instruments that looked like a fusion of technology and living tissue. Machines that breathed, monitors that grew from the walls like plants. The being who seemed to be in charge positioned himself next to my head while the other 2 monitored these biomechanical devices. You know, that's when I understood how little we really know about consciousness and how it can be manipulated. They weren't just studying my brain, they were interfacing directly with my etheric body, the energetic template that organizes physical matter. Using some kind of resonant field generator, they were able to map my entire chakra system and analyze how my consciousness operated across different vibrational frequencies. The main procedure involved inserting this tiny crystalline probe into my left ear canal. I couldn't feel the physical insertion, but I was acutely aware of what was happening on an energetic level. The probe established a direct connection to my crown chakra and began downloading information from my consciousness, while simultaneously uploading data about their civilization and purposes. Here's what I learned during that download. Earth is being observed by multiple extraterrestrial groups as part of something they call the Consciousness Evolution Project. Humans are developing psychic abilities at an accelerating rate, and we're approaching a threshold where we'll be able to participate in galactic communication networks. The beings who took me that night belong to a collective known as the Zeta Collective. They're primarily researchers and data gatherers who work with other ET groups to study consciousness development across different species. But this development needs to be carefully monitored to ensure it doesn't destabilize our planetary systems. They've been observing Earth for thousands of years, occasionally making direct contact with humans who have the potential to serve as intermediaries between our species. I mean, really, what they were doing wasn't malicious, but it was incredibly invasive. They were creating a permanent interface between my consciousness and their monitoring systems, so they could track my psychic development and use me as a data source for their research. The crystalline probe established what they call a quantum entanglement link that would allow them to observe my thoughts and experiences remotely. During the procedure, I also received information about the underground facility I'd remote viewed in Antarctica. It's a joint human-alien operation, where they're conducting genetic research and developing hybrid beings who can function as ambassadors between our species. Some of the human subjects are volunteers, but others are abductees who've been conditioned over years of contact. The whole experience probably lasted about 90 minutes, though time flowed differently in that space. When they were finished, I found myself back in my car on US 131, engine running, as if nothing had happened. But my left ear was bleeding, there was a strange metallic taste in my mouth, and I had detailed memories of everything that had occurred. I drove home in a daze, stopping twice to vomit on the roadside. When I finally made it to my apartment, I immediately started documenting everything while the memories were still fresh. I wrote for hours, filling 23 pages with detailed descriptions, sketches of the beings and their technology, and analysis of the information they'd shared with me. Over the following weeks, I noticed significant changes in my psychic abilities. My remote viewing sessions became incredibly accurate, but also chaotic and difficult to control. I'd set an intention to view a specific location and end up receiving information from multiple time periods and dimensional frequencies simultaneously. It was like someone had amplified my psychic receiver but hadn't given me better filters to process the incoming data. The bleeding from my left ear continued sporadically for about 3 months. Dr. Torres referred me to Dr. Amanda Kepler, an ENT specialist at Bronson Methodist Hospital. She found unusual scarring deep in my ear canal and some kind of foreign material that she couldn't identify. When she tried to remove it during a minor surgical procedure, the material seemed to dissolve before she could extract it. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Kepler told me after reviewing the pathology results. The tissue samples show cellular structures that don't match any known biological patterns. It's almost like the material was designed to integrate with your nervous system. I didn't tell her about the abduction, of course. How do you explain to a medical professional that aliens implanted monitoring technology in your ear? Instead, I said I'd been experiencing some kind of recurring inner ear infection and left it at that. But the medical evidence was just the beginning of a much larger crisis that unfolded over the following months. The real challenge was dealing with the social and psychological aftermath of the experience. I tried telling my boyfriend at the time, Ryan Matthews, what had happened. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and I thought he knew me well enough to at least listen with an open mind. But when I described the abduction, he looked at me like I'd completely lost my sanity. "Sky, you're talking about being abducted by aliens," he said, his voice heavy with concern and disbelief. "Don't you think it's more likely that you fell asleep while driving and had a vivid dream? Or maybe you had some kind of seizure or medical episode?" I showed him the medical reports, the documentation I'd written, the sketches I'd made, but none of it mattered. In his mind, there had to be a rational explanation that didn't involve extraterrestrial contact. The more I insisted on the reality of my experience, the more worried he became about my mental health. "I think you need to see someone," he said after a particularly intense conversation where I'd tried to explain the consciousness downloading process. "A therapist or maybe a psychiatrist. This kind of thinking isn't normal, Sky." You know what's really frustrating about that response? The assumption that anything outside conventional reality must be a sign of mental illness. I mean, I was still functioning perfectly well at work, maintaining my relationships, taking care of my responsibilities. The only thing that had changed was my understanding of the larger reality we're embedded in. But Ryan couldn't handle it. Within 2 months of the abduction, our relationship was over. He said I'd become obsessed with conspiracy theories and that being around me made him uncomfortable. I think what really bothered him was that I was no longer the same person he'd started dating. The experience had cracked something open in me, and I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. When I finally worked up the courage to tell her about the abduction, she immediately started researching psychiatric medications and therapists who specialized in delusional disorders. "Honey, I love you. But what you're describing sounds like a psychotic break," she said during a particularly difficult phone conversation. My family's reaction was even more challenging. My mother, Patricia Donovan, had always been the practical, skeptical type. These kinds of hallucinations can be symptoms of serious mental health conditions. Please consider getting professional help. I mean, really, how do you convince someone that you're not crazy when the experience you're describing falls so far outside their worldview? My mom had spent her entire career as a nurse dealing with medical realities, lab results, diagnoses, treatments that could be measured and verified. Alien abduction wasn't something that fit into her framework for understanding the world. My father, Robert Donovan, took a slightly different approach. He didn't dismiss my experience outright, but he was worried about the impact it was having on my life and relationships. During one of our weekend fishing trips to Gun Lake, he shared some advice that actually proved to be pretty wise. Maybe the question isn't whether it happened, but whether focusing on it is helping you build the life you want. That perspective helped me realize that regardless of other people's beliefs about my experience, I needed to find ways to integrate it that empowered rather than isolated me. "Sky, I don't know if what you experienced was real or not," he said as we sat on the dock watching the sunset, "but I can see that believing in it is causing you a lot of pain." That's when I started seriously looking for support from people who might understand what I was going through. Through online research, I discovered there's actually a whole community of people who've had similar experiences. I found forums, support groups, researchers who take alien abduction seriously as a phenomenon worthy of study rather than automatic dismissal. Reading other people's accounts, I was amazed by how many details matched my own experience. The paralysis, the medical procedures, the consciousness downloads, the ongoing contact after the initial abduction. That's how I found Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychologist in Grand Rapids who specializes in what she calls anomalous experiences. Dr. Morrison had worked with hundreds of people who'd reported UFO sightings, alien contact, and other paranormal encounters. She didn't approach these reports from a skeptical, debunking perspective, but rather as legitimate experiences that deserved careful, respectful analysis. "The first thing to understand," Dr. Morrison told me during our initial session, "is that you're not alone and you're not crazy. There are thousands of people around the world reporting very similar experiences to yours. Whether these encounters are literal, physical events or represent some other kind of consciousness phenomenon, they're real for the people experiencing them, and they deserve to be taken seriously." Working with Dr. Morrison was the beginning of my real healing process. She helped me understand that trauma isn't just about what happens to you. It's about how those experiences get integrated into your sense of self and your understanding of reality. The abduction had shattered my previous worldview and forced me to confront the possibility that reality was far stranger and more complex than I'd previously imagined. But Dr. Morrison also introduced me to other people who'd had similar experiences, and that's where I found the support community that became crucial to my recovery. She facilitated a monthly support group for experiencers, people who'd had UFO sightings, alien contact, or other anomalous encounters that fell outside mainstream acceptance. There was Margaret Chen, a retired teacher who'd been having contact experiences since childhood. Tom Rodriguez, a construction worker who'd been abducted multiple times over a 15-year period. Carol and Dennis Williams, a married couple who'd had a shared abduction experience, and several others whose stories were remarkably similar to mine. The group met in the basement of Unity Church of Grand Rapids, and it included about 12 regular members. "The hardest part isn't the experience itself," Margaret told me during my first meeting. "Most people can't handle the reality of what you've been through, so you end up feeling like you're living in two different worlds. The one where aliens are real and active on Earth, and the one where talking about that makes you sound insane." That resonated with me so deeply, you know? It's the isolation that comes afterward. Like, oh my God, finally someone who understood the cognitive dissonance of living with this knowledge. These people had found ways to integrate their experiences without losing their sanity or their connections to mainstream life. They'd developed practical strategies for managing ongoing contact, protecting themselves energetically, and maintaining their psychological stability. Tom shared techniques for what he called conscious consent protocols, ways to establish boundaries with non-human entities and maintain some degree of agency during contact experiences. Even when they're using technologies that paralyze your body, your consciousness still has choices about how to respond. Carol and Dennis described something they called couples contact preparation. ways that intimate partners could support each other through anomalous experiences rather than letting them destroy their relationships. But when he started having his own sightings and eventually his own contact, he understood that dismissing these experiences wasn't helping either of us. I learned about research being conducted by organizations like the Monroe Institute and the International Association for Near-Death Studies. You don't have to be a passive victim, he explained. Dennis was skeptical at first too, Carol shared. There are actually scientists studying consciousness, anomalous experiences, and human ET contact using rigorous methodologies. Dr. John Mack at Harvard, Dr. David Jacobs at Temple University, and others have documented thousands of cases similar to mine. I also learned about protective techniques that experiencers have developed through trial and error. Margaret taught me something she called energetic sovereignty practices, meditation and visualization techniques for maintaining your sense of self during altered states of consciousness. Tom showed me how to use intention and willpower to establish boundaries, even when physical control has been compromised. But the most important thing I learned from the group was that these experiences don't have to define your entire life. Yes, alien contact is significant and life-changing, but it's also just one aspect of human consciousness exploration. Many experiencers go on to develop careers in consciousness research, healing arts, or other fields where their expanded awareness becomes an asset rather than a liability. That perspective helped me start thinking about how to integrate my experience in ways that felt empowering rather than victimizing. I began studying everything I could about consciousness, quantum physics, and the interface between science and spirituality. I read books by researchers like Rupert Sheldrake, Stanislav Grof, and Rick Strassman, who were exploring the frontiers of human awareness using both scientific methods and experiential investigation. I also started developing what I came to call my resonant anchoring practice. This is a daily meditation routine where I establish energetic connections to the earth, my higher self, and what I think of as my spiritual support team. The practice helps me maintain my center when consciousness expansion experiences become overwhelming or chaotic. The technique involves several steps. First, I ground my energy by visualizing roots extending from my root chakra deep into the earth's core. Then I expand my awareness through each chakra center, checking for any energetic distortions or foreign influences. Next, I establish intention for how I want to experience consciousness expansion, with full consent, clear boundaries, and integration that serves my highest good. Finally, I create energetic shields around my aura and set up what I call alarm systems that alert me if any entities are trying to access my consciousness without permission. This practice became essential because the contact didn't stop after the initial abduction. Over the following months, I had several more encounters with the Zeta Collective, though these were less invasive than the first experience. They would contact me during meditation sessions or lucid dreams, sharing information about their research and asking for my cooperation with their consciousness studies. Through these ongoing contacts, I learned that my case was part of a larger study they're conducting on human psychic development. They're particularly interested in individuals who can maintain conscious awareness during dimensional shifting and who can serve as bridges between human and non-human consciousness. My forensics background was also valuable to them because it demonstrated analytical thinking and attention to detail. But here's what's really interesting. As I became more stable and grounded through my healing work, the nature of our interactions began to change. Instead of feeling like a helpless subject being studied, I started functioning more like a collaborative researcher. They would present me with information about their civilization and ask for my perspective on how humans might respond to various forms of contact. I learned that there are actually protocols within the galactic community for ethical interaction with developing civilizations. The initial abduction was conducted under what they call minimal intervention guidelines. They gathered the information they needed while minimizing long-term trauma to the human subject. The ongoing contacts were designed to help me integrate the experience and develop my capabilities as a conscious intermediary. This collaborative relationship helped me understand that not all alien contact is traumatic or exploitative. There are different ET groups with different agendas, and some are genuinely interested in helping humans evolve our consciousness in ways that benefit our entire species. The Zeta Collective, despite their clinical approach, are essentially researchers who see value in establishing positive relationships with psychically gifted humans. About 18 months after the initial abduction, I had what I consider my breakthrough experience. During a meditation session, I was contacted by a different group of beings. These had a much warmer, more nurturing energy. These beings explained that Earth is approaching a threshold where our species will either develop the wisdom to handle advanced consciousness abilities or will use them in ways that could be destructive to ourselves and others. They identified themselves as representatives of what they called the Galactic Council, a confederation of species working to support consciousness evolution throughout this galaxy. They offered to work with me as what they called a consciousness ambassador, someone who could help other humans understand and integrate contact experiences in ways that promote healing and growth rather than fear and trauma. The council beings taught me advanced techniques for consciousness navigation, interdimensional communication, and what they call species interface protocols. These are methods for facilitating understanding between humans and non-human intelligences, while respecting the autonomy and well-being of both groups. They're working with selected humans to help guide this transition in positive directions. This felt like a huge shift from being a research subject to being invited into a collaborative relationship. This training became the foundation for the work I do now. I've spent the last several years developing programs to help other experiences integrate their contact in healthy ways. I work with Dr. Morrison's clinic, facilitate support groups, and conduct research on consciousness expansion and human-ET interaction. I've also written extensively about my experiences and the healing techniques I've developed. My book, Conscious Contact, A Guide to Ethical Alien Interaction, was published by a small press that specializes in consciousness research. It's been well received within the experiencer community and has helped connect me with researchers and other contactees around the world. But the most rewarding part of my work is helping other people who've had experiences similar to mine. Every month, I get emails from people who've found my writing and feel relief at discovering they're not alone. I've worked with hundreds of experiencers over the years, helping them develop the tools and perspectives they need to integrate their contact in empowering ways. The healing process isn't linear, and it's not something you complete and then move on from. I still have challenging days when the magnitude of what I've experienced feels overwhelming. I still deal with skepticism and rejection from people who can't accept the reality of what I've been through. And I still have ongoing contact with various ET groups, which requires constant discernment and boundary setting. But I've reached a place where I can honestly say I'm grateful for what happened to me that night on US 131. Yes, it was terrifying and traumatic. Yes, it turned my life upside down and cost me relationships and social acceptance. But it also opened doorways in my consciousness that have led to the most meaningful work of my life. I've come to understand that the paralysis I experienced that night wasn't just a side effect of their technology. It was a teaching about the relationship between consciousness and physical form. When your body can't move, you discover that you are not your body. You're something much more expansive and resilient than you previously imagined. The fear and helplessness I felt during the abduction taught me about the importance of developing inner strength and spiritual resources that can't be taken away by external circumstances. And the ongoing relationship I've developed with non-human intelligences has taught me that consciousness is truly the fundamental fabric of reality, and that love and wisdom can exist in forms that don't look anything like what we expect. The isolation and rejection I experienced afterward taught me about the courage required to live authentically, even when that authenticity challenges other people's comfort zones. You know, when people ask me if I regret what happened, if I wish I could go back to my normal life before the contact, I always tell them the same thing. This is my normal life now. This is who I was always meant to become. The experience didn't change me so much as it revealed who I really am beneath all the conditioning and limitations I'd accepted as real. Because at the end of the day, we're all just consciousness having a human experience. And sometimes that experience includes contact with other forms of consciousness that are having their own experiences in this vast, interconnected universe. Like, oh my God, I never thought I'd be grateful for the most terrifying experience of my life, but here we are. And you know what? When you really understand that, when you really feel it in your bones, it's actually the most amazing thing imaginable.